Okay.
So let me introduce our first speaker, which is Rachel. Sorry, I'm
Ashley.
Rachel Ashley. Yeah.
Put you out of your misery there.
All I know about Rachel is she is chair of Edisbury European Movement Group.
I am.
Which is in, I didn't know was in the northwest.
Yeah, Edisbury Ware, that's its long title. It's actually in Cheshire, so we kind of span the northwest and I suppose the North Midlands. It's a vast constituency. It goes all the way from Chester down to Crewe and over as far as we neighbour Tatton. So we have the delightful Leicester McVeigh as one neighbour, and all the way up to Ellesmere Port. So and we border, of course, North Wales. So we have interests in the petrochemical works at Ellesmere Port along the banks of the Mersey, and we also have a lot of people who work at Airbus Industries in Broughton in North Wales. So yes, we have gone and done stuff in all of those places. And we are linked up to Crewe and Nantwich and Chester and Warrington and Liverpool and the Wirral, and so we have been pretty active. But we're only a tiny little group, but we're noisy.
Good. And I guess you're used to making noise as a musician. That's an Alan Partridge style link. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I've prepared, and here I go. Let's hope I can read it all in one go. Right, thank you for having me, Gavin, and everybody there in Hertfordshire. Nice to see some familiar faces that I've not seen since Marches. So I've prepared a piece on Brexit and the touring musician / entertainer. The loss of freedom of movement may have been buried by the pandemic, but as vaccination rolls out, the reality of where we find ourselves will emerge in all its true horror. The carnet, the paperwork, the price of that paperwork, the time it all takes down to a single string or a single plectrum means that musicians who have toured across our continent are now effectively stuck. It's prohibitively expensive and complex for anyone other than those at the very top of the industry, and even they are affected. This from a member of one of the most successful bands the UK has produced who wishes to remain anonymous. The music industry and touring musicians like myself have been urgently explaining for 5 years now to anyone who will listen why Brexit is hugely damaging to our ability to perform. Freedom of movement and frictionless travel in and out of the European Union has been an essential component to keeping our costs doable. We need the UK government to stop wringing their hands like Pontius Pilate and to get serious about owning that they created this problem by leaving the European Union without a deal for us, and that they need to do a lot more to fix it than falsely blaming the EU and pretending, as Boris Johnson has done, to be proactively doing something about it when in fact he did the opposite. It's not only a loss for us, but also a loss for the Treasury. We pay taxes on these overseas earnings, and we won't be paying them if we're unable to tour. The carnet, a log of all, and I mean all, the equipment crossing the border is a mammoth issue. Previously, just loading the van and off you go is now a bureaucratic nightmare. An opera singer friend tells us more about how it's affected him. In 3 ways. 1. The jobs I used to do working for French opera companies require an EU passport. Their contracts now explicitly state UK passport holders ineligible. In any case, some of those contracts can be more than 90 days, which is now the limit. 2. A lot of my work was done as jump in or DEP. Someone falls ill and you're expected to be on the next plane or train to be performing at 3 or 4 hours notice. No visas, no permissions, no clearance, just a passport and go. 3. Latterly, I've been doing lecture recitals with a pianist, which necessitates taking a laptop, speakers, and a keyboard through customs. Hitherto free, the carnets now cost more than the fee. The concept of depping is part and parcel of the musician's life. All of us have contacts of numerous people we can ask to dep gigs that we can't do, for whatever reason, illness or whatever. That whole network of depping has impacted artists across the board. Without an EU passport, you're now off the list. This is having a profound impact on players and singers. Added to all of this, we've now lost EHIC. Our opera singer friend points out that this adds extra burden in the form of health insurance, which in his case, as a former cancer sufferer, is simply prohibitively expensive, adding yet another barrier. Bessie May is a singer and actress who's travelled all over Europe, entertaining on cruise ships and holiday parks. She says, "This casting is open only to those holding an EU passport, is now so commonly spotted on casting briefs that I don't even flinch. As someone who spent 10 months in Crete and has worked in the Netherlands and Belgium multiple times, this phrase has caused a huge impact on the options open to me moving forward in my career. Touring productions, cruise lines, holiday resorts, and more are now no longer accessible to me as a performer. These make up a huge part of our industry, meaning there are now an excessive amount of unemployed actors, all now hungry for the same positions. This surplus of actors leaves us subject to exploitation. Producers can lower their rates of pay because they know actors are desperate for work. They can also take less care with production management, leading to mistreatment because they never need to worry about not having someone for the part. I have already seen this slowly become a reality. This worries me, particularly for young actors starting out in the industry. Spending years building up your career to have that taken away from you due to Brexit is heartbreaking. I now watch friends from other countries working on the jobs that I can no longer do purely because of Brexit. It's hard not to feel pushed aside by the system and bitter towards the whole concept of Brexit. Bessie May is young, she's talented and enterprising, but Brexit has severely limited her choices and opportunities and her life. My friend Richard has spent the last few years working in an ABBA tribute band, touring constantly across Europe. There are several very successful ABBA tributes, in fact. It's its own little micro-industry. They all know each other, they all dep for each other at very short notice, because they all know the gig, they all know the music, the staging, the choreography, etc. The UK passport holders are now out of the loop. My friends in the jazz world are similarly effective. They're niche, so the audiences are more spread out. They often spend extended time in the European Union. One friend has managed to get a German passport, so can still work, but the others are not so fortunate. They're now limited to the UK scene, which by comparison is tiny. Visiting cabaret across the holiday resorts worked on a system called flybacks. This entailed flying out to the resort, working the weekend, and then flying home. This is now finished. It's too complex, too expensive. Similarly, many entertainers lived and worked in resorts like Benidorm and flew back to the UK to gig at weekends. A friend who wrote music for Peter Kay, amongst others, toured extensively pre-freedom of movement and shares a reminiscence from his forthcoming autobiography. So we turned around and drove back down to the nearest garage in the town and bought some snow chains. Sorted. Back up the hill we went. At one point, one of the snow chains snapped and the loose chain hammered on the van for a few miles till we stopped and removed it. We next drove onto a train to pass through the Bad Gastein tunnel. Having driven through Belgium, Germany, Austria, Italy, and Bulgaria, we finally got to the Turkish border at Edirne. After all that, we were told we had to unload our equipment and put it in a locked hut until morning, when a customs man would arrive to check the contents against our carnet. Oh good, another night sleeping in the van. We awoke to a banging on the door, signifying that it was time to meet with customs. It turned out all was needed was to cross his palm with $100, and we could go. Bloody backhanders. And finally, a story from an expert in music education. We did music education concerts to bring together Irish Catholic and Protestant primary school children as part of a wonderful scheme called EMU, Education for Mutual Understanding. These were the first performances ever to attempt this and were a huge success. This often meant travelling between the north and south, often in one day, a performance in the north in the morning and one in the south in the afternoon. The physical demands of this were hard enough, but coupled with the nightmare of a carnet check at the border, made it a journey we always dreaded. With a Luton-sized van containing over 40 percussion instruments, guitars, keyboards, double bass, amplification, PA and costumes, this meant we had to be at the border at 5:30 in the morning for long checks of every single item, all of which had to be checked back in on our trip back later in the day. The craziness of this system meant, however, that to meet our deadline of an afternoon concert back in the province, we could not afford to endure the exhaustive and protracted rechecking in of our equipment on the way back to the north. So we did as most people did and found one of the dozens of B roads that happily led you freely back to the north, completely unchecked, with no consequences. This was also the case for the Channel Island concert tours, where we would have to sit and wait for hours at Poole or Weymouth Harbour for the same long, drawn-out process, sometimes even including having dogs sent into our van. But unfortunately, we had to go through the arduous return journey process, as sadly there were no B roads back across the English Channel. And remember, all of this doesn't just affect musicians, it affects all entertainers, from comedians to magicians to circus performers, to educators to jugglers to unicyclists. These stories illustrate how losing freedom of movement has meant that the control of our borders actually means controlling and limiting what UK artists and entertainers are able to do. We now know that the European Union had a draft agreement prepared that would have gone a long way to easing these issues. Johnson declined. That choice was petty, spiteful, and vindictive. And so here we are. It severely limits careers. It limits tax revenue. It limits creative collaboration. It limits opportunity. It limits peace. It limits UK arts. It limits all of us. Why would anyone ever want to do that? Thank you.
Thank
Right,
you.
thank you very much. Very eloquent talk. Now we'll have a few minutes for questions. I just wanted to, I know you got back to us at the end, but the issue of Johnson's duplicitousness, I'm not sure everybody will have had the full details, because I mean it's all been so disguised. Could you describe how he, what format duplicity took?
Well, we were told that it was blame shifting. It's as simple as that. We're told now in Barnier's book that there was a draft agreement prepared by the European Union that was proposed to the British government, and they turned it down. They said no. And then went on to try and blame the European Union for being intransigent and stopping UK artists from working in the European Union, which just simply wasn't the case. A draft agreement had been proposed and Johnson's government turned it down. I can't tell you how angry that makes me feel.
And me.
Yeah. It's just, these are real people with, sorry, I'm crying. These are real people with real lives and real careers. And why would you do that? Why?
What can we do? That's the most important thing. And it's astonishing. What can we do? We need to do something about that, because it's obviously not just the music industry, is it? It's all industries, and some more than others, obviously. But literally, it's like taking the rug out from under your feet, isn't it? Entirely.
Totally, yeah. I mean, when you think about if you've ever been, if you've had small children and you've ever been to a Mediterranean resort, all of the people who are there, from not just the musicians, but the childcare staff, for example, a lot of them go out from the United Kingdom, don't they? And they work for longer than 90 days. They do the whole of the summer season. A lot of my friends who are entertainers, there's, a whole raft of people who work the summer seasons, pantomime, summer season, pantomime. That's their lifestyle. The cruises, if they're, cruising the Mediterranean, same kind of thing applies. Why have they done this? Is it pure vindictiveness and spite? It is.
It's to stop the reciprocation. I think that's what Johnson didn't want. EU citizens coming here having the opportunities here that citizens here would also have within the European Union. But the European Union is much bigger than here. So
For sure.
really, there's no equanimity there at all, is there?
No.
I can't understand why he would not agree to, you know, allowing artists to continue free access to the jobs in Europe. And
I suspect it's to keep the far right folk off his own back. I suspect it's that everything that Johnson does is to maintain his own position, and I think that is often the bottom line with Johnson.
We have a question from John Kane.
Thank you very much for your comments. It's a disaster for the music industry. However, it sounds similar to the Erasmus issue. Johnson doesn't want any of this nasty contamination with those European people. I know that sounds a bizarre situation, but he's demonstrated it in other ways too.
Yes, he has.
I think he's making the naive assumption that, you know, we heard this during the debate itself, that they need us more than we need them. So somehow, eventually, they will relent, you know, and this is a temporary period. I don't believe that for one moment.
It's English exceptionalism, isn't it?
It is that kind of thinking. It's sort of neo-imperialist thinking. They need us more than we need them. So eventually they will crumble and we will win, you know.
It fundamentally is an ego trip. We're better than you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Jenny.
Oh, hi, Rachel. I was just going to ask you, well, we've covered some of what you've said on our Glasgow Loves EU chats as well. So, and it's just hearing all the full range of situations is just horrendous, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I was just, the Barnier book, do you know if the agreement, was it wider than musicians? Was it for IT workers and things as well? Or?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I know that there was a specific proposal drafted for entertainment visas that was not backed by the UK government. Beyond that, I don't know any more detail.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, I mean, is there anything in the TCA at all about the music industry?
I don't know.
Right.
I think it's the same problem as with services in general, isn't it? We all know how neglected services are on the TCA. I think music is in exactly the same boat.
Well, I have to say, most of my work, I have to say, I've not really been affected at all. Most of my work is done down the line. All of my work, up until next week, has been from my EU clients. So I sing and voice stuff. So, for example, I've just done a huge job describing the history of the city of Metz on the French-German border. So if you visit the city of Metz and you put on the headsets for the guided walks, that'll be me you have to listen to. And that's fine. So my only problem potentially was with being paid, but they're still able to pay me, which is fantastic. And the other job that's come in was from Holland for an English language course, which again is fine. So it's in terms of like because none of us knew. And that was one of the big problems for the voiceover community, and we had extensive conversations about it. Nobody knew how it was going to work. So we all knew that we could get the work, we could do the work, we could probably even send the work, but would we be able to get paid? Nobody knew the answer to that. And of course, we can't watch the Eurovision YouTube feed. It's not available in the United Kingdom.
Chris, you've got a question.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm chair of East Kent European Movement, but speaking from Würzburg, over there in the background, which is in northern Bavaria. I haven't really got a question. I just wanted to make 2 points. I'll be brief. Yesterday, I attended the German-British Society talk by Paul Stebbings of TNT Theatre Company. He's got German nationality. is doing something here in Germany, and they tour internationally, but they had problems getting some of the actors in recently into Germany through Munich airport. Took them 3 hours to get through the airport to accomplish all the paperwork and so on and so forth. So it sort of fits in with the topic that was being spoken about now just now. I had to have my lunch, that's why I was blacked out. So that was one comment. And then I'm on the working party for Festival of Europe next year, which we want to be British-wide, Britain-wide rather, preceded by the Summer of Europe. So it's something I'm willing to talk to about it a bit later if you want, but watch out for it. We've formed a company 2 days ago. It's well underway. Thank you for listening, but it was a comment which I felt was appropriate.
Okay, and Jenny, you had a question.
Sorry, I haven't actually got a question. I've
okay.
only just realised how to put my hand up on Zoom. Sorry, Rachel.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I don't know how to put it down yet.
Right. Okay, any more questions? All right, so let's now move on to John, who has some slides for us, I think.
Yeah, I've got some slides. Let's see if these work. They did a few minutes ago, so this is all very whiz, you know. I like this. Hang on. How do I make that full screen? There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Hey, marvelous, isn't it? Technology works. So what am I going to talk about? Aviation, huge, vast subjects. I'm only going to slice off a little bit that I know very, very well, which is aviation safety regulation. I think as we were chatting earlier about everybody wanting to be safe in the air. This is how we have achieved it and some of the barriers that are now in our way. So what I'm going to actually do is go through a little bit of history, because this subject isn't so easy to understand unless you know something of the background. The story so far, the decades of progress, we made decades of progress. And then all of a sudden, bang, 2016, the referendum came along and we have disruption, uncertainty, disconnection. And then I'll get on to talk a little bit about where I think we are now and what needs to be done. The history of cooperation in Europe, sort of in this domain, aviation safety kicked off around sort of 83, which interestingly, I graduated in 82. So that's what my work environment looked like at the time. And we can appreciate just how much of the world has changed since then. But there was a memorandum of understanding between 11 countries in Europe to all work together. In the world, we have a thing called ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. That's like the WTO for aviation. And there are 194 countries in ICAO, it's based in Montreal. There's individual sovereign states. And of course, in each country, you have a national aviation authority. And here in the UK, that's the UK Civil Aviation Authority. Now, ICAO works to harmonize, encourage cooperation, to standardize, to get everybody to work together. It became, if we go through that period of the 80s, pragmatic, sensible. In fact, there was really very little alternative for European industry than to work together, to compete on a global scale. So that's why we have Airbus, Leonardo's the helicopter manufacturer, and Rolls-Royce. These are multinational companies. These are not national companies anymore. They work on a global scale. They need to be able to work on a global scale. So regional cooperation, particularly in Europe, is absolutely essential. And there are only two dominant regulatory systems in the world at the moment. Okay, China have got their own thing, Russia have got their own thing, even the Canadians do their own thing. But when it comes to buying an aircraft, if you're in Indonesia, You'll ask, well, has it got a certificate in Europe? Has it got a certificate in the US? That's probably the only question you will ask. Two dominant regulatory systems, the European one and the US one. How did it all start? Well, back in 1990, there was a thing called the Cyprus Arrangement, where 24 countries got together. And then the European Union's competence expanded, because Europe wasn't initially involved in this. But the first regulation to impact aviation safety was 3922. And that required all the member states, which was 12 then, of course, to cooperate and work together and apply the same standards, which were called joint aviation requirements. So if you had new aircraft, the new aircraft had to meet these safety standards, the joint aviation requirements. So that's when Europe started to become involved. This is applicable in 1992. So, it doesn't all go back into the 1970s, really. It's something that has evolved and developed pragmatically and to everybody's benefit. And it was under the umbrella of a thing called an organization called the JAA at that time. Now, one of the problems with the JAA is it was not constructed under European law. So it was like an intergovernmental organization. It required people to be good gentlemen, and do things properly. But we found then that the application of standards varied greatly between the different countries. And this is where EASA, or the European Aviation Safety Agency, was created in September 2003. I joined them in November 2004 as they established their headquarters in Cologne in Germany. So I had 11 happy years in Germany, actually setting up and establishing and building the organization. So building, you don't often get the opportunity to do that, build an absolutely new aviation authority at a global level, on a global scale. So it was a great privilege to be involved there. The idea is to have high uniform standards, but independent of national interests, so that there is a high uniform standard. Why should, a Dutch person or a German person or an Italian person or a Greek person or a British person be any more or less safe than any other when flying around in a civil aircraft, across Europe? The European system is a very integrated system. Aircraft are moving around the airspace all over Europe. Those aircraft are used to taking off and landing everywhere and anywhere. So free movement, this is part of really the single market expansion. And so Europe's competence in this area grew. Now, of course, the Brexiteers fought a battle against this, but at the time, the UK was fundamental in making this happen. We even chaired the management board at the beginning of the organization. The first group executive director was French, but the chair of the management board was British. And France and the UK working together to create this brand new entity, which was to work at a global scale. And so that's EASA. So when Brexit came along, we thought, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Now, there are non-EU states who are members of EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency. So the non-EU states are Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So everybody's assumption, Parliament's assumption, industry's assumption was that the UK would continue to be part of the organization that it built. EASA is one of the prominent countries in that organization. So it wasn't really until Grant Shapps made an announcement about a year ago that the UK will leave EASA, that the shock ran through the industry. That was a dramatic change of policy, because the presumption before that was everything would continue under some new guise, with the UK remaining a member of the regulatory system, where there were enormous advantages in us doing so, in that harmonization of standards, common standards across Europe, across the globe, in fact. So that left a lot of people, my former colleagues in Cologne, all the Brits who are working at EASA, in a bit of a dilemma, what to do. If I want a career path in aircraft certification, I've got to stay here. So many of them now have German citizenship and they've actually stayed in Cologne. And so all that expertise has been lost to the UK. They no longer work at London Gatwick, which is where the UK Civil Aviation Authority is. All that expertise is in Cologne. A lot of the design approvals. Now, in order to get an aircraft in service or an engine in service like Rolls-Royce, you have to have a type certificate. Those certificates are issued by EASA in Europe. And to do that, you have to have an organization approval. Even Rolls-Royce's organization approval is now German. It's not British at all. It's not a British company anymore in that sense. The design approval has moved to Germany and the certificates are issued to the German company. So we've lost an enormous amount of influence. Now, fortunately, within the TCA, this is maybe different from the music industry, but there were several sections that dealt with these issues. And it talked about a future BASA or bilateral safety agreement and a comprehensive air traffic agreement where we can agree, you can land in this country, you can then take passengers on in somebody else's country and move them to another country. All the freedoms of the air would be negotiated and included within these new agreements, which have yet to be written. They were just mentioned in the TCA. So since 2016, we've had an enormous amount of disruption, uncertainty, and disconnection. But strangely enough, this week has been a good week because there's been the signature, the signing of a technical implementation procedure, some mutual recognition of products between the UKCA and EASA. So at a technical level, at a working level, still, forget the politics up here. At a technical working level, still people are still working together. So there has been some technical implementation procedure written and agreed. But this is one tiny, tiny, tiny part of the overall, all the issues that remain. All UK registered aircraft now are third country aircraft in the EU. So they're treated no differently from a Turkish aircraft or an Albanian aircraft or a Moroccan aircraft. We are a third country now. So all the bits of European law that apply to third countries apply to us, which usually leaves us pretty disadvantaged. We have to, under the EU system, we had a huge number of bilateral agreements with the rest of the world. So we've now had to forge our own new bilateral agreements between the UK and all those parties on aviation safety. Industry now has to pay twice because both EASA and UKCA work on a cost recovery basis. They charge fees. So now if you want a certificate in the UK and a certificate in Europe, you have to pay twice, whereas in the past you just paid once. There's also the problem of regulatory duplication, because all the EU law was moved into UK law, duplicated, and therefore it may change at a different speed or in a different way from European law. So you have regulatory duplication. We've completely moved away from harmonization, the aims of 50 or 60 years work. So there is the possibility of regulatory divergence, but nobody knows. Nobody knows what the intention is at the moment. We've also lost influence, I think, on the involvement in our level of setting standards and influence on future technical standards. Technical expertise is scarce in a few particular areas. So we've lost expertise. Some of that expertise exists only in certain places in Europe. We've lost the mutual recognition of licenses and qualifications. I mean, pilots, air traffic controllers, and engineers have to be licensed. And at the moment, there's a temporary agreement for a few months or a couple of years on recognizing some of those licenses. But the things you can do, with your signature, as a licensee, have been reduced. So we've lost some of the privileges that we used to have under the existing system. There are other bodies, like I mentioned, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. How is the UK going to work together with Europe? Because every time Europe does something in ICAO, it votes with 27 votes. We vote with 1 vote. So if we disagree with the EU in ICAO, we're really not going to win unless we have the US or some other major countries on our side. So already there's a differential in our power and influence. What's to be our international standing? As I say, the reputation, if you're going to buy an aircraft somewhere, you look for an FAA certificate, you look for an EASA certificate. And of course, the country that's advancing most rapidly is China. you know, and having some influence over China is certainly important. Research, people have mentioned Erasmus and the Horizon program. Now, we do have the ability as UK countries to participate in Horizon, but we're disadvantaged in terms of intellectual property. You know, that's one of the things with, you know, European research money. It sort of protected the intellectual property of European companies. So now we can participate, but we don't have access to a lot of that intellectual property. Working practices are changing very rapidly. Now, if there's a lack of synchronism between the way we work and the way that Europe works, I can see trouble. I can see trouble coming. And there's more I could add to this list, but I won't. Right, what should we do? Now, my ethos, and I think the ethos of many who are working in the industry, is we do not compete on safety. We should not compete on safety. It is ridiculous to compete on safety. That is one of the reasons why we harmonize standards. We all try to apply the same rules, the same standards. Why should we compete on standards, on safety? We need to forge some new partnerships. You know, there may be associate membership of organizations that we could construct. We need to be creative in the way that we create those new regional partnerships, because it does seem that we're not going to go back into the EU quickly, but we need to rebuild some of those relationships. New mechanisms for cooperation need to be invented. And just as mentioned in the music industry there by Rachel, freedom of movement. You know, we've got to be able to move engineers, we've got to be able to move technicians, we've got to be able to move experts, we've got to be able to move people around in Europe because we have an integrated industry. And if we can't do that, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. On ensuring, because we now, well, we do have access to some European funding, which is under the TCA. But one of the things I've been arguing with my MP about is the funding of research. Because under the Horizon program, we were getting a disproportionately large amount of money out of the EU system because we have some excellent universities. So we were actually getting more out of the system than we were putting in. So we have to ensure that the national funding is at an equivalent level to that which we've lost. And of course, we're not seeing that happening. We're seeing it happening in one or two specialized areas, like composite, aircraft composite technology, structures and things like that, but not in every area. So there's much to be done. Ensuring that we have the technical competence, because a lot of the competence has been lost, you know, as I say, the people who've remained in European organizations, we don't necessarily have access to them. We need to now train, upskill our own people and create expert career paths for those experts. Because if we haven't got economies of scale, you know, some of the very niche specializations that we need in the future, yeah, we just won't be able to sustain them. Those people need a career path, you know, where they can move from, say, Airbus into the regulator, out of the regulator, then across maybe into the US industry and back again. You know, we need people to share knowledge across the globe to ensure that we continue to have the high record of safety that we have in aviation at the moment. Of course, regulation never stands still. You know, you may believe it does, but it doesn't. We have new methods, performance-based regulation coming along. Now, again, if there's a movement in the UK and a movement in Europe and they're not synchronized, we just create complexity and chaos. Everything is being digitized. Would you believe it? There's an enormous amount of paperwork that still exists in the aviation industry, signing off aircraft and things like that. There's a huge effort to digitize. So you need standards, you need common standards, you need to ensure they're global standards, regional standards. Individual national standards don't cut the mustard anymore. So there's some ideas, some things that need to be tackled. That's what I wanted to say to you. I hope I haven't, you know, gone too techie on you. I've just given you a brief overview of some of the issues and some of the things that we need to address. Very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Gavin, you're muted.
You're muted. Gavin, you're muted. Rachel, what do you want to say?
One of the biggest employers in our area is Airbus. Now, before Brexit, we were saying that we would lose Airbus. as an employee, I mean, it's massive. It's thousands and thousands of people. I still see the beluga flying over my house every day. What's the situation with Airbus? Do you think? I know that it's probably not your specific area of expertise, but you may.
No, I think I can give you a view on that, because I think at the moment, for existing products, that's what they're working on. I mean, the A380's life is over rather rapidly, unfortunately, but COVID has changed the shape. It's going to change the shape of the industry. New environmental rules are going to change the shape of the industry as well. The carbon footprint is a big concern. The problem with, I think, the UK elements, as long as the UK government continues to invest, continues to put research into technology, then Airbus will see it attractive to maintain those facilities. It is really the future investment that is the area of sensitivity. Now, the more all those issues that I listed, if those barriers are not overcome, then when they're making future investments, they'll say, well, maybe we'll move those to Madrid or Hamburg or Toulouse. Maybe it makes more sense to. Airbus have a plant in Alabama. They have a plant in China. These are global companies. They make global decisions. If it is more attractive to move elsewhere, that is what they will do.
This is the thing that really astonishes me about the whole attitude of the government generally. So they seem not to have noticed that globalization already happened.
There is a naiveness. And as I say, it's a neo-imperial thinking. They need us more than we need them, which I'm afraid is just not true. So
I'll see the beluga flying over for the foreseeable then.
I think so, because we've accumulated, particularly in some areas of technology, composite technology, structures, aircraft structures, we've accumulated such a high level of expertise that at the moment it's still very attractive to come to the UK for those technology areas. But how long that lasts, whether that investment continues, a lot of these things are up in the air. And the more barriers we put in the way, the more difficult it is going to sustain that position. Any more for any more?
John, you need to unmute.
Thank you very much, John. It's excellent and depressing. Could you tell me, is there part of your organization challenging the government and working with government?
Well, I'm no longer there now. I've come back. Interestingly, I had 11 years in Cologne building the organization, and then I left at the beginning of 2016. So I came back at the beginning of these. I'm doing a bit of consultancy work at the moment. So I came back at the beginning of all of this referendum shenanigans. Yeah. So yes, I mean, at a working level, there are still good in relationships, but there's a turnover of people, as there is in all industries. And so a lot of it, it's a remarkably, in certain specialized technical areas, it's probably the same in the music industry, Rachel.
We all know each other.
Rachel, in the French way, Rachel. There are a small number of people who are pivotal in the decisions that get made. And if we isolate ourselves from that community, which we seem to be doing at the moment with a degree of arrogance, the long-term game is not, it's not a good one. It's not a good one at all.
Thank you.
Any more for any more?
Any other questions?
I'm baffled you with science too much.
Right, wonderful.
It's just really depressing. And,
again, I was trying to have a hopeful bit at the end there, because there are ways of solving these problems if you are open-minded enough and you put the political dogma to one side. And you say, what practically works? How do we get people to work together? How do we
being a member of the European Union practically
works? Well, or slowly edging your way back to some forms of
step by step.
Yes, but you need a governance that will allow that. And Boris Johnson doesn't seem to have the experience base to encompass the real diversity across the board that the United Kingdom is and needs to be. He just doesn't seem to feel that he needs to make the investment in that diversity of industries. He seems almost single-minded, and it astonishes me. And how do we counteract that? There's only one way to counteract that, and that is to change the government. But how do we do that? You know, whilst we fight for our industries, and whilst I'm not employed in either the aviation industry or the arts at all, I feel incredibly invested because my son is about to graduate from the Guildhall, and what will there be for him? And he is a jazz saxophonist, so it doesn't get more niche than that, you know. I mean,
in my last podcast, I interviewed a singer called Tina May, who spends an awful lot of her time in France, in Paris particularly, because the jazz scene in France and Germany and Sweden, in fact, is just so much more vibrant than it is here.
Absolutely, much bigger. Yes.
Yeah, it really is. And without being able to go to those centers of, you know, that's where jazz is happening at the moment. Why? I don't know. It's just the way that things just pop up in different parts of the world. And jazz in Sweden and jazz in Germany, Berlin particularly, and Paris. Well, Paris has always been a center.
But you learn and expand as not just an artist, but a human being when you experience these things.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So it's limiting for everybody. It's just.
I love my French clients. I love them so much, and I just feel like just so close to them, you know. And we they're terrible at English and I'm terrible at French, but we manage.
I didn't quite become a Rhinelander when I lived in Germany. I still can't understand carnival in Cologne. It's in Cologne. It's carnival is bonkers.
But that's part of the beauty of it, though, isn't it? Yeah, that
fun,
is.
But it's bonkers.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, I had a question for you. Somewhere near the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the UK having to pay twice.
Well, industry has to pay twice, so ultimately you, the passenger, have to pay twice, because both the ARSA system, which was built on a UK model, and the UK civil aviation work on a fees and charges basis. So a good part of the funding that keeps the agency going comes from the fees that they charge industry for certificates, you know, or for inspections, or, you know, it's the way that regulation is done without any burden to the taxpayer. You know, the industry has to pay, you know. So if you want now a certificate both in the UK and in Europe, you pay twice, whereas you paid once in the past, which of course, in my mind is, well, this is one of the arguments that industry made of the foolishness of leaving the ARSA system. But we've done it.
Well, why? What was the argument for leaving it, other than not being a member of the European Union?
Do you know what I think? Well, when Grant Sharp said, there was lots of speculation, lots of anger as well. You know, the anger. But it's this: they cannot stomach the idea of being beholden unto any piece of European legislation. Mm. So if you have rules and regulations, even if you have influence over those rules and regulations, the idea that, you know, it was written somewhere in Cologne, a piece of guidance material that you're then applying in the UK, you know, can't.
So the implication is emotional immaturity.
Dogma, political dogma. That's the only.
Emotional immaturity is bang on there, I think, Sarah.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, just, oh, I'm not having anything to do with that because of what it is, not because of how it functions or whether it does me any good or bad. Yeah.
But it's pure ideology, I suggest. Pure ideology, which is a partial glimpse of the truth.
But Johnson doesn't really have any ideology, does he?
It's also a romanticism about the past as well. It's also a romanticism about the past, as somehow, you know, they will then apply British standards. We will have superior standards, and they will then be beholden to us because they will apply our standards.
But
that fits clearly in the ideology,
fiction, isn't it? That's not.
Which might have happened in the 50s, you know, the 50s and the 60s for, you know, for a certain amount of time. You know, we have got, you know, some very smart people and some very, you know, well-developed techniques and methods. But the world don't work like that, you know. Economies of scale matter, you know. And of course, you know, if you do something, set a standard for 500 million people, you know, you're full not to follow it, you know.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, Chris.
Yeah, John, is there any hope of putting more pressure on the government, you know, from industry, or do you think that's all been done, and as we've just been speaking, they just ignore it on dogmatic ideological grounds? Is there any
I
scope?
think if you're an industry lobbyist, you just carry on, you know, trying to influence. And that's what ADS, which is the industry body manufacturing, is trying to do at the moment. You have to engage and you have to try and convince. But as we're seeing with the farmers at the moment, you know, the NFU trying to convince them about the Australian agriculture deal, you can put logical arguments to them, you can put rational, you can say this is in your interest. Doesn't mean to say you're going to sway opinion. At the moment, with 40, if you look at the opinion polls, this is the political side. I try to stay away from the political side. As long as Johnson has about 40% of the population on his side, I'm afraid he doesn't see the need to listen. You know, why would he? You know, he can get re-elected with a majority of 100. So these people are whinging, they're whining. You know, we can do what
that's where the media comes in, and it's really, really important.
So I'm afraid I've tried, you know, rational. I'm an engineer. I'm very rational. You know, rational arguments don't cut the mustard. Yeah, you've got to have something else. You know, something that really
to move people on an emotional level, which is what Leave did.
To change the climate of opinion with a large number of people.